Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of Studio 3, Cosmological Brain by instructors Ed Keller and Carla Leitão. This research studio approaches its mandate to create and cultivate a cosmological brain. We ask, what are the sociopolitical genetics, the pedagogies of the general economy, and the environmental controls necessary to build a cosmopolitically inclined brain? What are the infrastructural captures of attention currently in operation on our planet, which might lead towards or away from a general cosmopolitical agency with a mind? We begin by temporarily distinguishing and isolating technical and conceptual parts of the thinking entity to inquire into novel ways to design these substructures and bring them together in a renewed framework of assembly. The studio will explore and work with different aspects of planetary and universally scaled cognitive architectures and the systems through which potential general intellects might operate, biological artifacts functioning across billions of years, cultural infrastructures, linkage of feelings from the viral scale to general principles of feedback and self-regulation and awareness, the necessary pathways for material, energetic, and information systems to interact across myriad timescales to yield a spectrum that can be called mind. Our instructors, founders of AUM Studio and SPAKE AE, architectural design, creation theory, scenarios, and interactive media, residential installation, competitions in Europe and the US, joined the Data and Matter Group show Venice Biennale in 2018. AUM Studio, Keller and Leitão have convened more than 20 international conferences and lecture series. Their work and writing has appeared in Volume, Punctum, Triple Ampersand, Evolo, A+U, AD, Metamorphosis, Wired, Metropolis, Assemblage, and Octagonal. Keller is a designer, professor, writer, musician, multimedia artist, and independent scholar. From 2012 to 2020, he was the director of the Center for Transformative Media at the New School, associate dean in Parsons, and previous academic appointments include Columbia University, GASAPP, as professor teaching advanced architectural design, graduate studies and seminars, and serving as the acting director of the AADMS program in 2001. SciArc from 2004 and 2009, where he founded and coordinated the Mediascapes program and was a full-time faculty member from 2007 to 2009. And this, sorry for this. And RIP, UPenn, Pratt, Parsons, FIU, and Bennington, variously between 1996 to 2010. And he has spoken on architectural, film, architectural intelligence, technology, and ecology internationally. Recent seminars at the New School Parsons include Post-Planetary design, soundscape, and designing AI. Leitão is an architect, professor, and writer, a lecturer at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute School of Architecture. Leitão studios and seminars explore the intersection of architectures over urban systems, technology, ubiquitous cultures, and immersive VR and RPIs. At the Crave Lab, Leitão has developed academic work and research around concepts of assemblies and front-end design for control rooms, interactive spaces, and education environments. Revising private, public, and institutional architectural typologies. Leitão is instructor at Lisbon Local Coordinator of SITREP, an international school teaching design research studios and promoting collaborative design events in several countries. Recent seminar studios and lecture courses include Biodrome, Architecture in the Age of Epidemics, Landscape of Oblivion, Proto-Room, Inception, Vision Interface, Environmental History and Theory, Contemporary Design Approaches, and the Architecture of Civil Forums. She co-chaired with Ed Keller an ACSA conference panel on addressability in Detroit in 2017 and created an organized event, Portugal Now, in Corner AAP Folio, an exhibition of more than 20 Portuguese offices with conferences in Ithaca and New York City. Lives and works in New York, USA, and Lisbon and Portugal. I will give the mic to Ed, please.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Studio 3 Cosmological Brain. It's good to see a few familiar faces. Alexandra, Tegan, hey. I hope that a couple of these talks during this won't seem too familiar. I'm trying to bring a new kind of angle to what we're doing this semester, approaching this Studio 3. I think there'll be a lot of opportunity for branching out, even if you hear me say a few things that I have said before. So let me screen share here, and I will I'll jump straight into this. The format today should be a introductory lecture, and for us to discuss the expectations around the next 8 or 9 weeks, and then I'll do this kind of hour-long, maybe hour and 15-minute-long introductory talk, and then we can have a conversation about the material in the talk. In terms of the setup of the course, what we thought we would do is run 4 or 5 seminar classes up front in the first half, which essentially will be lectures with reasonably manageable reading and film viewing and listening and media assignments each week. And then we'll have a usual seminar discussion after those lectures. And then for the second half of the seminar, we'll talk about your projects in process. And then at the very end, we'll have a kind of a coursework review with external guests. For those of you who haven't been in our reviews, we're formal in the sense that work gets presented, but we're very relaxed in the sense that it's not an overwhelming kind of design review or crit. It's very much about work in progress, and we bring people in who are fellow travelers in terms of our goals for speculation around what the course might be. We are thinking of designing for worlds for minds and minds for worlds. And so the entire arc of the next 8 or 9 weeks will be a series of lectures and conversations around what it means to constitute a mind, what it means to work with tools that are oriented towards designing minds or harvesting minds to design worlds. And then ultimately finding ways for your work to connect to this hypothesis in the seminar that it might be possible to think at a truly cosmological scale when discussing the emergence of intelligence or the design of intelligence. Of course, we'll refer to very familiar names like Stanislav Lem with his Solaris, his master's voice, Summa Technologia. We'll also be looking at Oberhaus's extraterrestrial languages as a way of trying to understand, again, at a cosmological scale, what it means to think of self-sustaining systems in feedback, which have the capacity for either sentience or sapience. Stephen Shaviro's Discognition will be an important reference for us as well, and so forth. And I'll unpack all of this. It's most of the assignments are in the syllabus, although the fourth week lectures haven't been, materials haven't been posted yet. They will be in the next few days. And one thing that Carla and I wanted to articulate for you all was that you can use this seminar to develop new work, can be individual or group, or you can use it as a kind of a forum to continue work that you have in progress. So if your own personal work, your own artwork, your own research resonates with the theme of the seminar, you've already got something underway, then our role will be to support your research and give you feedback. And in the context, the cohort of folks in the seminar will be involved in doing the same. An output for a project like this could be a design research paper. It could be a summary of research. It could be new texts, images, three-dimensional design, films, soundscapes, etc. So this is all a kind of a conversation that we'll have over the coming weeks in terms of what output and outcome might be. We're enormously flexible in terms of that. So before I dive in any further, does anyone have any questions about format and so forth? Again, it's pretty straightforward, and I don't imagine because of the flexibility built into the way that we're thinking about this as a kind of a mini design research studio. I don't imagine there will be too many questions. Yeah. Okay. So.
Wait, there is
Yes,
some hand
please.
raised.
Oh yeah, I don't see the chat. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, please go ahead.
Looks like not anymore. Let's move on.
Okay. Okay, very good. So today, what I wanted to talk about is lead off with a question around what the limits of intelligence in mind might be, what it would mean to map the current and near future state of cognition in the context of radically shifting models of mind and intelligence in emerging AGI. A big focus for the next few weeks for us will be to ask the question what we can learn by observing non-human systems. And of course, Stephen Shavir's Discognition is a fantastic core text to branch off from because of his focus in that book on non-standard cognition and his juxtaposition of scientific and philosophical models against science fictional models. I'm not going to read through all of this. I think I'm just going to continue directly into the talk because you can read this material from the syllabus. Although I will read this quote from Lem because it's quite a beautiful quote from his Summa. Every technology is actually an artificial extension of the innate tendency possessed by all living beings to gain mastery over their environment, or at least not to surrender to it in their struggle for survival. Homeostasis, a sophisticated name for aiming toward a state of equilibrium or for continued existence despite the ongoing changes, has produced gravity-resistant calcareous and chitinous skeletons, mobility-enabling legs, wings, and fins, fangs, horns, jaws, and digestive systems that enable eating, and carapaces and masking shapes that serve as a defense against being eaten. Finally, in its effort to make organisms independent of their surroundings, homeostasis implemented the regulation of body temperature. In this way, islets of decreasing entropy emerged in the world of general entropic increase. Now, this is a very, very important passage for us from Lem because Lem is looking at the emergence of life and complex systems, self-sustaining systems, but by extension, this is a foundational hypothesis to understand where sentience and sapience come from, or what frameworks in our world, what frameworks in our universe make sentience and sapience possible, and what challenges they might face. Life feeds on life, we devour to survive, right? So we would begin by asking the question, is sentience and sapience really linked to energy flow, to physical entropic parameters and constraints, to informational entropic parameters, constraints, and flows? And this will be a kind of a refrain across the entire seminar that we'll return to. We'll dive into Freeman Dyson's comments on this. We'll dive into Lineweaver and Egan's text on gravity, life, and thermodynamics, Michel Serres, the philosopher, and so forth. This is a kind of a framework behind the larger question of what it might mean to design a cosmological brain. And of course, in Solaris and in his master's voice, Lem takes this up over and over again. It's also worth noting here, and this will come more into focus for you as we progress through the seminar, that the goal of the seminar might be to also ask the question, what does it mean to design a mind? What does it mean to design a mind? Does this demand that we design, as Ben Goertzel observed years ago, and as I mentioned in the title of the seminar, to design a world for mind or a mind for world? And so one other refrain through this seminar will be asking the question, what does it mean to design not just a world, but a universe, a pocket universe? Cixin Liu's work in the three-body problem, Dark Forest, Death's End trilogy will be an important reference for us. We'll touch on that here and there over the next few weeks. Oh, there's logistically one other point that I forgot to mention. Carla will join us in the second half of the seminar to discuss your projects and work in progress. And so for the next few weeks, I'll be doing lectures, and then Carla will join us for the second 4 weeks. So this question of entropy and this question of what frameworks are necessary for mind to emerge are the driving questions in the seminar. We're going to start by asking questions about scale and where cognition might take place. When I say scale, I mean physical scale and temporal scale. And the next 2 weeks will involve us jumping from the subatomic all the way to the cosmological and back, and asking the question, where is mind and where are cognitive processes? Now, as Ben Goertzel said a few years ago, in this quote, he argues that we actually don't know enough about human or animal minds to really model artificial intelligence on the architecture of a brain. We don't know enough about our own minds. And he also argues that, as he points out with his typical sense of humor, on the other hand, if you do succeed in emulating a human brain in detail, then all you have is a human brain. And this sets up for both Ben Goertzel's work in his own AI development and singularity nets development. It sets up for both Ben Goertzel's work and for us a very, very important question, which is, what are the limits of sentience and sapience that we might want to use as a baseline to branch off from in the goal of designing cognition, designing a framework or a stack that would support any or specific forms of cognition, and situating that entire design project against the limits of our concepts of intelligence. You know, the key idea that we start with is that it's not possible to discuss sapience or to discuss the design of intelligence at any scale, whether cosmological or local, without at least conducting a provisional inquiry into philosophy of mind and considering the range of non-human or non-standard modes of intelligence. Not only to imagine the limits of intelligence beyond the human, but also to point that lens and series of questions back at ourselves to try to understand what it means to define what we see ourselves when we look at ourselves. So given that current neuroscience and philosophy of mind and AI design are all fraught with contention and argumentation and incomplete or obsoleted models, you know, every day, every week, our models are obsoleted, we face this substantial challenge to understand what it means to go beyond the epistemological horizons and the technicities which establish epistemological horizons for knowing ourselves and for knowing the world. And, you know, we face this challenge because most humans, most of us imagine that AI will in some way look like the way that we think. And Ben Bratton, of course, has talked about this in a very beautiful way, and I'll get to his quote in just a moment. In Ex Machina, we see this unpacked in a kind of a brilliant and initially extremely seemingly offensive and savage way. The core plot line in Ex Machina shows us Ava, this physical robot AI, which is being given an extended Turing test by some humans, confronting its self. I mean, we could say herself, that's not quite appropriate, confronting its self in the context of some of the other AIs, which have all been gendered by one of their creators and by the filmmakers. And then by extension, the epistemological horizons that they occupy are extended out to include us as the audience of the film. So for those of you who haven't seen it, disturbing but excellent meditation, not only on the gender problem and the human to non-human problem, but also the epistemological horizon question. Now, as Ben says, more people know Turing's foundational text than have actually read it. This is unfortunate because the text is marvelous, strange, and surprising. Turing introduces his test as a variation on a popular parlor game in which two hidden contestants, a woman and a man, try to convince a third that he or she is a woman by their written responses to leading questions. To win, one of the players must convincingly be who they really are, whereas the other must try to pass as another gender. So the Turing test, tragically, is about gender identity before it's about machine versus human identity. Benjamin, again, that we would wish to define the very existence of AI in relation to its ability to mimic how humans think that humans think will be looked back upon as a weird sort of speciesism. Now, this sets up the framework, of course, for us to ask, well, what other forms of thinking would or should there be, either that we can discover or that we can imagine, invent, and model, that would take us past that weird sort of speciesism? Should we go beyond the weird sort of speciesism? I mean, my sense is yes, we should, but we can discuss this. What would those non-standard or alternate models of cognition be? Well, Ben says immediately, we would do better to presume that in our universe, thinking is much more diverse, even alien, than our own particular case. The real philosophical lessons of AI will have less to do with humans teaching machines how to think than with machines teaching humans a fuller and truer range of what thinking can be, and for that matter, what being human can be. And this is a beautiful quote, especially for those of you who've played around a little bit with Midjourney or with ChatGPT or any of the other generative large model machine learning AI tools and toys that have emerged in the past couple of years. Of course, we'll have a few discussions over the coming weeks about where sentience might be in those tools. I have strong feelings about that, having spent a lot of time with them, but we'll talk about this a lot. But before we talk about these limits of mind, let's talk about life. Because if we think about that quote from Lamb from his Summa, if we think about the question of entropy and energy availability to living systems, then we have to ask, well, if mind emerges from living systems, and we'll talk also quite a bit about mind emerging from complex non-living systems. If mind emerges from living systems, then what are living systems? Of course, we can go back through Agamben and his meditation on forms of life, and the older non-distinctions between Zoe and Bios, and the collapse of those distinctions, and our current notion of what a form of life might be. Now, for those of you who've immersed in Agamben a bit, you know that there's a kind of an ethical and moral imperative that Agamben is picking up when he uses the term form of life or forms of life, specifically to argue that there should be forms of life that are free and that have agency against the juridical or military or legal imperatives that would take away life or only define life according to the ability for life to live or die. So Agamben is making an argument that life is and should be more than that and should be recognized as such. But this is a starting point to ask, what are the limits of life? And where is consciousness? So if we go back to Jaynes and his notion of bicameral consciousness, right in the beginning of this book, the argument is made that consciousness is a property of matter. And of course, we see a sort of a related argument made in Stephen Shaviro's Discognition. You could say it's a kind of a panpsychist argument, or related to panpsychism. The relationship of consciousness to what we are conscious of is not fundamentally different from the relationship of a tree to the ground in which it is rooted, or even of the gravitational relationship between two celestial bodies. I suppose in a way that could be the quote that leads off Studio 3 Cosmological Brain, right? Certainly. The argument then a little bit further down the page, if a piece of chalk is dropped on the lecture table, that interaction of chalk and table is different only in complexity from the perceptions and knowledges that fill our minds. It's a pretty radical contention, right? It's a pretty radical hypothesis. The chalk is thinking too, according to that argument. You know, the silver crystal that's deposited electrolytically is also thinking, according to that argument. But how is it thinking and where is it thinking? And, you know, obviously, is it sapient in the sense that you and I can think about thinking? We can build layer upon layer of metacognition to review our subjective experiences, our physical experiences, to review the process of thought itself, to attempt to review the process of thought, looking inside ourselves. It's not doing it in the way that you and I are, but is it doing it to some extent in that way? If we jump to this beautiful example from the book of Kells that Henri Phocion talks about in Life of Forms in Art, the argument that's made by Phocion is that this form, the ornamentation, the geometry, the embellishment, the illustration sitting on top of a religious culture, the illustration sitting on top of a deeper cultural heritage, which takes Celtic forms and starts interweaving them with, Christianities, with threads of Christianity. The argument Phocion makes is that that is thinking. And it isn't the people who drew the illustration that were thinking. It isn't the people who illustrated a religious passage who were thinking. It's the form itself that was thinking. And so in this sense, these forms emerge because of an internal vital force inherent to both matter, but to any formalism, a lifelike force that you could compare to the Deleuzian notion, the Deleuzian-Guattarian notion of the machinic phylum. So this is an animate way of looking at matter, of looking at physical and chemical systems, of stones, of weather systems. Everything is to some extent animate. Now, we mentioned time frames, across what time frame something might be living. The lifespan of an individual organism. No. The oldest memories on Earth, as Ballard says in The Drowned World, the brief span of an individual life is misleading. Each one of us is as old as the entire biological kingdom, and our bloodstreams are tributaries of the great sea of its total memory. So when we think, where's the life in this page from the Book of Kells? It delves deeply into centuries of religious history, humans living out religious history and belief systems passing through humans and being converted from a form of belief and passion to a form of geometry and ornamentation, being embedded in books, and so on and so forth. And so the lifespan arcs out across centuries, and it arcs out across millions of years. Again, as Ballard points out in The Drowned World, the time codes are carried in chromosome and gene, that they arc deep into our heritage, millions of years to moments when a particular crisis one of our ancestors, far before they were human, might have encountered, which chemically and genetically changed that living creature, and which was then passed down creature to creature across millions of years. And so the time span of the body that's living is this kind of crucial question. And the instant you expand that time scale to say, oh, well, the body that's living is both, it's living for 50 or 70 or 100 years, or maybe in the case of some trees, 3,000 years. But it's also the DNA itself, which is maintaining through permutation and change a coherent form, which is still DNA after all these millions of years. And so the question becomes, are we alive? And DNA is part of what constitutes us and makes it possible for us to be alive? Or is the DNA alive and we are a meta-emergent system that arises when DNA manages to proliferate itself through a range of cellular and multicellular hosts. Just as we might ask, are you and I thinking right now, or is thinking a metasystemic tendency, capacity, and phenomenon, an epiphenomenon that emerges when you have things like wet meat sack bone bodies that wander around on the surface of the planet, like you and I? Okay, so let's take a deep breath and think about the situation from a mediascape perspective that we're dealing with right now, because we want to jump across a range of different timescales. And we can start by simply looking at the situation we face in terms of feedback loops, technological feedback loops. I'm not going to play through all of Matsuda's hyperreality video, but it's a fantastic and extremely disturbing view of what augmented and extended reality might be. I don't know, in 2027 maybe. You can look at this on your own. I'll just keep moving. But then the question becomes, what technicities are in place which connect to these different scales of time that we're talking about, which connect to these different physical scales? A single individual, a population of individuals. As Strauss said in Accelerando some years back, trying to imagine kind of where we would be right now. Science fiction, but good science fiction. It's night in Amsterdam, morning in Silicon Valley. Today, 50,000 human babies are being born around the world. Meanwhile, automated factories in Indonesia and Mexico have produced another 250,000 motherboards with processors rated at more than 10 petaflops, about an order of magnitude below the lower bound on the computational capacity of a human brain. So we're suddenly thinking human life scale, days, hours, decades, petaflops, human cognition, how many processes in a human brain, technicity in industry, how many compute cycles being produced in technology, and how soon will we produce the equivalent? Another 14 months and the larger part of the cumulative conscious processing power of the human species will be arriving in silicon. Now, it's worth noting that a few months ago, Daniel Holtz, one of the founders of Midjourney, made a point in an interview in the Register saying that every image that you make when you make an image using Midjourney is peta operations of compute time. So if you've used Midjourney, and I assume some of you have, you've made some images. You've made maybe one, or maybe you've made a few hundred, or maybe you even got deeply into it for a few months and you made thousands. Every one of those images took peta-ops of compute. Holtz says something, it's a funny interview because they say something like, I don't remember exactly if it's 10 peta-ops or thousands of peta-ops, but one image is at least peta-ops. And that Midjourney is a radical transformation of the average end user's access to compute time, that it is the most powerful access to compute time for the average first worlder who has an internet connection and uses Discord to produce an image on Midjourney. So we are maybe not dialed into exactly the timeline that Strauss is talking about in Accelerando, but we're awfully close. We're awfully close. And again, this quote is sitting here to, in a very reiterative way, as a refrain, talk about scale. That's what I'm going to talk about for the next half hour, 45 minutes. Time scales and physical scales. How do we take the idea that alternate forms of cognition demand, we think, across much smaller and much larger time scales and much smaller and much larger scales of space, and turn that into actionable concepts as designers, as artists, as philosophers? So some of you will be familiar with the Eames's power of 10.
The picnic near the lakeside in Chicago is the start of a lazy afternoon, early 1 October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now, every 10 seconds, we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds, the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide. The distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Cars crowd the highway. Powerboats lie at their docks. The colorful bleachers are Soldiers Field. This square is a kilometer wide, 1,000 meters. The distance a racing car can travel in 10 seconds. We see the great city on the...
And so on and so forth. It zooms out to the scale of the galaxy and beyond, and then it zooms back in to what they knew then of atomic structure. So if we zoom out and we think about these scale leaps, we start with the meter, and at a certain point, our ability to grasp the scale starts to break down, right? We all can grasp 1,000 kilometers because you've gone on road trips or if you've flown somewhere. You can even kind of grasp 10,000 kilometers because you might have flown from like Los Angeles to Tokyo or something like that. But then once you get to 10 to the 8th, it starts getting a little bit difficult, at least for me. I mean, we can kind of grasp it. And I'm sure you've all seen videos of people who've put the sun as the scale of a basketball in a field somewhere, and then, you know, shown that Jupiter is the scale of marble somewhere, you know, 15 kilometers away, et cetera. And so you kind of understand how big the solar system is. That number might be wrong, the number I just gave. If the sun was the scale of a basketball, I don't remember how far away Jupiter would be. So the question here becomes, you know, how do we work with these scales and work with them such that they're useful to us to understand where cognition might take place? And similarly, in terms of second to millennia, this particular one is one that I love, and I always love going back to, because if you start with 1 second, then you can scale out a long way, and you can still grasp it. Like you can go all the way to 10 to the 9th. Right? A gigasecond, holy smokes, 31 years. We can all really kind of grok that quite directly. We've lived decades, so we understand this. 10 to the 10th, it's a bit harder. 10 to the 11th is quite difficult. 10 to the 12th is 31,690. About the age of Chauvet Cave's paintings from Herzog's film, Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Some of you will have seen that. But you all have hard drives that have terabyte storage on them, right? So you can grasp what a tera is. A terasecond. If you think about your hard drive, you're like, oh yeah, I have bytes on my hard drive. I have terabytes on my hard drive. I understand that. Here it is. It's in my pocket. Holy shit, I have 4 terabytes on this. But a terasecond is 31,000 years. Does that help you understand the hard drive capacity for storage better? Or does it help you understand the depth of human history better? So if we go through these timescales, you know, and this is, as I've said, when we've taught this seminar before, these are super provisional timescales. Just because a gesture gets associated between a meter and a second doesn't mean that this gesture is always 1 meter in 1 second, you know. Humans perceive in fractions of seconds, and gestures can be repeated over centuries, thus they don't take place in only 1 second, etc. But if we think about the limits of human perception and action and thought at that scale, and we just use that as a rubric to start, we think about this beautiful project from Marshmallow Laser Feast, the Eyes of the Animal project, which tries to understand what the perceptual space of a creature like a dragonfly might be in the forest, and what scope of vision and sound and vibration might be accessible to it. And you ask yourself, well, we're talking about a meter in a second, but it isn't just a human gesture. It can be a small tree or a bush. It could be a cluster of fungi. It could be a swarm of bees. And it could be the rings of a tree that's a meter in diameter, but is actually 350 years old, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And then if we jump scales from a meter to cities and forests, jump all the way up to a kilometer and a kilosecond, and we ask, can a city think? Can a forest think. Obviously not the way that you and I think, but if so, what kind of intelligence is afforded them and across what time scale? So if you're designing a city, you're designing a thinking system. You design many different layers of thinking system. And Benjamin's work in the Stack book is just essential to kind of having this conversation. But what if you're designing something bigger than a city? Well, anyway, let's quickly zoom through cities and infrastructures and layers in the stack. What does it mean if you design a clean water system for a city? How do you do that? How do you extrapolate out from Snow's identification of cholera in London, so famously, from 1854? And how do you then implement feedback loops and control systems such that the city can be healthy? Which doesn't seem like it's the city thinking, but if you think about the city comprehensively across 1,000 years, then this might be the equivalent of one small component of a cell in a much larger body that functions to maintain the overall life of that larger body. And similarly, if you jump to the example of the forest, and if you jump to the example of the planet, and you ask yourself, how is a river thinking if it iterates across a basin of attraction over 1,000 years or 100,000 years or even longer? And how does the planet think when you imagine the plate tectonics of the computation and intelligence at a geologic scale across plate tectonics? And then diving deeper into this, of course, each of those color-coded layers has billions of years of processes embedded in them, volcanic processes, sedimentary processes, compressive processes, metamorphosis. So how do all of those timescales come together? If we zoom down to the bacterial, the viral, and we zoom in to the millisecond, the sub-millimeter, then where is a comparison to be made between the purported intelligence of a bacterial colony and the functioning of a CPU or a network of computers? Slime mold, the famous example that, of course, Stephen Shaviro was obsessed with, which seems to have computational capability, but it has no neural system whatsoever. It's a self-organizing system. It's like a Conway's Game of Life CA system or a Wolfram CA system. Very simple agents that have the capacity to organize themselves in several ways that then lead to much more complex behavior. And even give them the ability to solve simple problems, relatively simple problems like maze solving problem. So how does the single cell calculate on so many scales? And if we keep zooming into the micrometer, the microsecond, deeper, the nanometer, the nanosecond, what are the kind of limits of perception? What kind of mind might already be present at those levels? The virus, the bacteriophage, the microsecond, 10 to the negative sixth. 1 microsecond was the time to execute one machine cycle in an Intel 80186 microprocessor. nanosecond cycle time for a gigahertz processor, of course. This is a nice comparison. 1 nanosecond is to 1 second, as 1 second is to 31 years. And if we jump to Sadie Plant, we'll read her introduction to the spam book for next week. If we jump to this beautiful meditation that she made on viruses and their impact on the Dutch tulip mania and the emergence of a human economic bubble, speculative bubble. One of the most important insights we get from Sadie Plant's text is that the virus has a real pathway that connects not only to the petals of the flower, but that link out to a human desiring system and a human economy. DNA transport laterally across populations through viral infection is thus a form of computation. Again, as she says, perhaps it's all a question of perspective and time. The virus that's malevolent for the bulb is beneficial in relation to the flower. The code that breaks through one security barrier is also the incentive to develop new lines of defense. She says, tulip mania was certainly a great irregularity, a malfunctioning of 17th century financial markets, causing the first large-scale economic crash, or arguably first. It was a kind of fever, infectious as the virus itself, a runaway sequence of events triggered by the smallest of anomalies, which was, as it happens, effectively repressed as soon as its nature was known, the viral infection of the flowers. Those flowers now can be bred as opposed to needing an opportunistic viral infection to create the beautiful colors of the flower petals. So we've jumped across a range of scales, and in the next 2 weeks, we're going to take those 2 weeks to spend more time with those scales. Where at each of these scales is cognition, and where at each of these scales is a world? For what audience or inhabitant does the world exist? A very, very beautiful passage in the beginning of Cixin Liu's Dark Forest, the second book in that trilogy, where some human beings are at a location which used to be a science location, a science research location, radio telescope location. And there's an ant climbing up a memorial. And so Cixin Liu goes down in scale to talk about the life world of the ant and how it's a bridge to the words that are carved in the stone on the memorial. The ant sensed vibrations in the ground and knew from how they intensified that another giant presence was approaching from somewhere on the ground. The giant presence is some human beings walking. Paying it no mind, the ant continued its climb up the formation. At the right angle where the foot of the formation met the ground, there was a spider web. This the ant knew. It carefully detoured around the sticky hanging strands, passing by the spider lying in wait, its legs extended to feel for vibrations in the threads. Each knew of the other's presence, but as it had been for eons, there was no communication. At the foot of the formation, the spider that Logis had swept aside with the flowers was beginning to reconstruct its web. It drew a glistening strand from the rock face and swung itself like a pendulum to the ground. 3 more swings and the skeleton of the web was complete. 10,000 times the web could be destroyed, and 10,000 times the spider would rebuild it. There was neither annoyance, nor despair, nor any delight, just as it had been for 1 billion years. Now, if you haven't read this trilogy, even if you haven't read this trilogy, you probably can intuit that that is a mise and a beam. It's an analogy that's being drawn by the author between the ant and the spider and humans and something else. In the case of the trilogy, it's humans and an alien species, an alien civilization. And the comparison is being drawn by making a scale shift to say that the ant is prey for the spider and the spider is predator of the ant. And they are aware of each other. The ant doesn't hit the web, therefore it isn't eaten by the spider. And that this relationship has been in place for hundreds of millions, if not billions of years. And that relationship is extrapolated out to the cosmological scale in Three-Body Problem, Dark Forest, and Death's End. And again, we're not going to read the whole trilogy, but we'll read some passages from it. And for those of you who have read it, perhaps we'll be able to discuss it a little bit more in detail. So how do we as humans position ourselves against these scales? You know, the very notorious Biosphere Project, which didn't work because the oxygen CO2 balance wasn't able to be maintained, is one design and technological example that we could refer to try to understand feedback loops, feedback and feed-forward loops that do and don't work. Now, the Halprins, who were dancers, choreographers, and landscape architects, the two of them used what they call the RSVP cycle to develop both their landscape designs and also their dance and theater events and performances and choreographies. Using that loop to understand a given world, an analysis of the given world, a set of iterations of processes upon the given world, a performance, and then a second iteration through the loop. How do we understand how these feedback and feed-forward loops work? And in The Little Prince, there's, of course, the example of the mini planet that has baobab trees growing on it. And as the Little Prince says, you know, it's a question of discipline. The Little Prince said to me later on, when you finished your own toilet in the morning, then it's time to attend to the toilet of your planet, just so with the greatest care. You must see to it that you pull up regularly all the baobabs at the very first moment when they can be distinguished from the rose bushes, which they resemble so closely in their earliest youth. It is very tedious work, the Little Prince added, but very easy. But if you don't do that, the baobab is something you will never, never be able to get rid of if you attend to it too late. And similarly, if we think about feedback loops, phase changes, this example that I never get tired of talking about, even though it's quite sad, of the albatross or the seagull that has died because of the plastic garbage it has eaten. This image from Chris Jordan's Midway Project. We can understand this in the context of Lem, and this quote from Lem's Summa. We're faced here with circular processes in which causes become effects and effects causes, and in which numerous instances of positive and negative feedback are at work. Living organisms in biology or subsequent industrial products in the technical civilization are only tiny elements in these higher processes. Traditional biology appeals to thermodynamics as a reliable arbiter. The latter declares the shift from greater to lesser complexity to be the norm, yet the emergence of life was a reverse process. So the bird and the industrial process are both situated in this larger framework. In the case of the bird and the lighter and the plastic caps that we see there, the human that designed those things had no idea that a bird was going to eat them and die. But that doesn't change the fact that it's possible for albatrosses to eat plastic garbage and get killed by it. So as Tony Fry noted, designed things keep on doing, they keep on timing in the world. They keep on making consequences happen. And this lesson would be one which we as designers and thinkers use to understand how systems work in unanticipated ways or unmapped ways. Also to allow us to understand that the act of a designed object like a plastic bottle cap goes on far beyond its presence as a bottle cap that keeps a bottle closed and keeps the soda inside the bottle. Yeah, keeps on doing what it does when it has the capability to do, the power to affect and be affected. And of course, as we understood, not only from these examples, but also from Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, which we'll spend some time with in the coming weeks. These creatures are situated in a planetary scale network of relations, energetic, informational, and presumably even for the geese, desiring. Leopold says this about the geese. It's an irony of history that the great powers should have discovered the unity of nations at Cairo in 1943. Well, that's just one historical example that he chooses. The geese of the world have had that notion for a longer time. Each March, they stake their lives on this truth. In the beginning, there was only the unity of the ice sheet, then followed the unity of the March thaw. Well, the ice sheet lasted for tens of thousands of years, and then there was a thaw, but it wasn't just March. And the northward hegira of the international geese. Every March since the Pleistocene, the geese have honked unity from China Sea to Siberian steppe, from Euphrates to Volga, from Nile to Murmansk, from Lincolnshire to Spitsbergen. The waste corn of Illinois by this international commerce of geese is carried through the clouds to the Arctic tundra, there to combine with the waste sunlight of a nightless June to grow goslings for all the lands between. And in this annual barter of food for light and winter warmth for summer solitude, the whole continent receives as net profit a wild poem dropped from the murky skies upon the muds of March. That wild poem, of course, is the Song of the Geese Flying. This reminds me of a great passage or series of passages from Michel de Certeau in The Practice of Everyday Life, where he talks about the coup, the punchline of the joke being delivered, the conversion of energy into information or information back into energy and matter. And for de Certeau, it's about agency in the world. It's about telling a great story and getting fed dinner in exchange. You know, I come to you, I have nothing to give you. I can only tell you a story. But you liked my story enough that you gave me dinner. Thank you for the tasty snack and for the bed and the roof over my head tonight. I hope I told you a good story. And the geese tell the entire continent this story, and they have been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years. And they've been transporting the genetics of the corn from Illinois and the energy of the corn from Illinois to the Arctic tundras where they have their goslings and raise them and then fly back. And so this is the scope and the scale of energetic processes, which also link to informational processes, which also are a substrate for cognition. Je dois décharger au meu planète. Je quitte ma planète. So let's think again about the cosmological brain and ethics, and think about examples. Well, the alternate history that Cixin Liu talks about in Three Body Problem during the Cultural Revolution, the battles raging across Beijing, as Cixin Liu says, like a multitude of CPUs working in parallel. Their combined output, what is it? The Cultural Revolution. What other examples can we look at across history that allow us to understand how human interventions and actions and agency are not so much designed by us, they're simply instantiations of the arcs of life and energy and information that we see across tens of thousands of years with the life of the geese. Now, the Nuremberg rally site in the early 30s, used by the Nazis. I often pair this up with this quote from Antonin Artaud to try to understand what were the Nazis doing? Well, Artaud in Theater and Its Double talks about this notion that he would be able to, on the affective level, communicate with his audience like a snake charmer would, with the music in it, and the snake charmer's music and the snake charmer's motions would communicate with the snake, which feels the vibrations through the ground. Artaud, recasting theater's capacity and his own interest in not meaning, but affect, which precisely was what Speer and Goebbels and everyone who built out the Nuremberg rally sites were doing. But to what end? How do we situate this in a kind of macro historical framework? Peirce in Anabasis talks about this. A great principle of violence dictated our fashions. I don't like this English translation of anabasis, but my French isn't good enough to do a better translation. Authority over all the signs of the earth. And what does it mean when these attempts collapse? I'm not going to spend time with Tansey because it would take too long to unpack it, but to jump from this notion of the human intervention at a scale which can cascade out into the centuries and the millennia, leaving behind beautiful ruins, kind of what Speer wanted to do in a way, or optimistically thinking of the living city, that computational process that Cixin Liu talks about. The battles in a Chinese city during the Cultural Revolution are computational. You can understand them computationally, just as Ruskin would understand Venice computationally. A millennia of human history. Ruskin says, the glacier stream of the Lombards and the following one of the Normans left their erratic blocks wherever they had flowed, but the lava stream of the Arab, even after it ceased to flow, warmed the whole of the northern, and the history of Gothic architecture is the history of the refinement and spiritualization of northern work under this Arab and North African influence. Now, as I've said many times before, Ruskin is using the lava flow or the glacial movement. It seems as a kind of a metaphor, but no. Ruskin is thinking that the flow of Northern Europeans over 500 years, 700 years, and the flow of Arabic culture over 700 years, passing through cities like Venice or Istanbul, those flows across centuries literally are best understood if we imagine them like lava or glaciers. So it's a model. It's not a metaphor. And then, of course, this clip from Ghost in the Shell, which I always show. I mean, so what does it mean to make a, I mean, I don't have to unpack that quote. It ties together so many of the themes that we've been talking about in the past hour so perfectly. How do we make the leap from the notion that life and cognition both are instantiated in very graspable timescales, graspable seconds, minutes, hours, days, years, but also much vaster timescales? And how do we then make a link to something that would tie sapience to agency and what I, have been working on for some years, empathy. There's a lack of empathy in the examples we get in Dark Forest, Cixin Liu, where empathy is a possibility, but it certainly doesn't exist between the Trisolarians and the humans. It barely does. A few isolated instances. Important ones, though, in the overall story. And what kind of empathy exists between the ancient civilization that we learn a little bit about in His Master's Voice by Lem and the humans? His Master's Voice is a very, very important text in this context because the dry, irritable, jaded narrator's voice, the scientist who's a researcher working on His Master's Voice problem, the message from the stars, this irritated, world-weary scientist understands that empathy between humans and a radically alien system might be impossible. So how do we design a form of life that can interact with another form of life which is also a cognition that can interact with another cognition. And when we dive into Oberhaus's extraterrestrial languages book a bit, we'll talk about that a lot.
What is it? I don't know. I don't want to stay here tonight.
We don't have a choice.
Please, come on.
It's too late in the day for us to move on.
Come on, let's go outside.
So there's some pretty there's some pretty intense body horror moments in Annihilation. But in the end, and the book a little bit more than the film adaptation, it's about refraction, as they term it in the film. Refraction of one species through another. And the cause of the anomaly in Area X seems to have been either a meteor with alien life on it or perhaps a crashed alien spaceship. Hard to know exactly what it is. Or a crashed alien body that's both a spaceship and a meteor and an alien. Yeah. Which is interacting with the environment by refracting human thoughts and memories, human DNA, through plant DNA, through animal DNA, through animal morphology, and hybridizing them, and mixing them. Similar in a way to what happens in Lem's The Invincible, which we'll read a bit from. And this film, owing a tremendous debt to Ballard's novel, The Crystal World. In fact, even taking character names from The Crystal World. And in Vandermeer's original novel, the characters don't have names, but in the film, they do. And those names are taken from J.G. Ballard novels. So one of the questions that comes up here in searching for something like an empathic cosmopolitics would be, is this an example of an empathic cosmopolitics, or is this like super sinister and predatory? Because this human being like had weird snakes living in its belly and was gutted by one of its friends and then exploded in a gorgeous, kind of welt of enormous fungal glory, which seems pretty violent. And the film is, as I said, it's kind of got a lot of body horror in it. It's more violent than I had remembered. I watched it straight through a few months ago and hadn't quite remembered how intense it gets. So is that violent? Or is it just an alien that has a different notion of this sort of limits of life, playing around with the stuff that it's got ready to hand? I use the term ready to hand totally loosely because the alien doesn't seem to have hands at all. It gets hands when it mimics a human, but you wouldn't say it has hands. Yeah. And so this becomes this kind of key question, like what constitutes an empathy in The Invincible, again, we could ask, is there communication taking place? Is there empathy taking place? Is there a possibility for shared language or shared gesture? In the Invincible, it doesn't seem so. I mean, without giving too much away, most of them die. In Solaris, in the different versions, Tarkovsky's version, Soderbergh's version, Lem's original version, we see a couple of different permutations of what kind of communication is available or possible, and how it might take place, and what the kind of end results might be. I mean, Soderbergh's version ends with, of course, the man and the woman reunited happily, even though one of them had suicided, et cetera, et cetera. Everything is forgiven, Chris. We don't have to think like that anymore. Whereas Tarkovsky's vision ends with the father and the son reunited. The father, kind of a god, Christ-like figure, reunited in a fantasy world on the surface of the ocean planet Solaris. Lem's original novel ends in radical uncertainty, with us not really knowing if the humans will survive on the surface of the planet, if there ever was any communication between the ocean mind and the humans. And that, of course, is what Lem would do, as Lem does something very similar in his Master's Voice, ends in a place where it's impossible to know, and what Peter Watts kind of does in Blindside, it's impossible to know if communication has taken place. Kind of what happens in Annihilation also. You don't really know if communication has taken place. It could just be that, when she gets out of the shimmer, she's infected by the alien, just like her husband was, but they're not really human anymore. They're kind of pea zombies maybe, or they're just body snatched. There's no way of knowing. Very different than Soderbergh's film of Solaris, and a bit different than Tarkovsky's as well. And so how do we situate the project of designing a mind? Now, bear in mind, I'm talking about artificial intelligence, AGI and ASI as a project, as much as I'm talking about the kind of wild science fiction supposition from his Master's Voice, that an alien civilization would literally write the laws of physics in a new universe to make it just slightly more possible that life would emerge in that universe as that universe grew and evolved, which is kind of one of the possibilities in his Master's Voice. So I'm talking about both of those projects at the same time, because we are right now designing AI and AGI. We're building it. And it might result in human level AGI. And if it does, most of us think it's going to almost instantly turn into weakly godlike artificial superintelligence. So what are we doing as we design these systems? And how can we imagine the design parameters, the control of the design parameters, the way that Lem does in his Master's Voice, at a literally cosmological scale? So that's kind of, that's kind of what we're dealing with in this seminar. From his Master's Voice, this is a quote, the irritable scientist researcher who's pulled into this project, along with all of the other scientists and mathematicians and physicists and military. My first thought was that either the letter was not meant for us, that by pure chance we lay in the path of its transmission between two conversing civilizations, or else the letter was intended only for those civilizations that, having passed a certain knowledge threshold, were able to both detect the cleverly concealed signal and to decode its meaning. In other words, you can get the message and you can try to decode it, but if you're just not advanced enough, you'll only be able to decode parts of it and you just won't get the whole message. What does it mean? Do you pull in a linguist like we see in Villeneuve's film Arrival? Or do you pull in someone like Stephen Wolfram and Stephen Wolfram's Kid to design the film pseudo software, pseudocode, and alien language system.
Louise. I am Louise.
Sir, Donnelly is taking off his hazmat suit. Permission to abort? Continue the session.
I think those are their names.
So what are we gonna call them?
I don't know.
Such a beautiful film. Very optimistic, right? Even though, you know, some bad things happen in the situation. And Louise is faced with becoming a person who, by existing across multiple arcs of time, becomes aware of her own future and has to then question what it means to have free will in the context of knowing one's own future. Carla and I have talked about this when we taught the LEM seminars a few years ago for Julieta Aranda. Beautiful project that Julieta put together. And we talked about the artifact and universal systems as artifact. That the artifact could be an object, a device, a component, or a subroutine of a system. So language could be an artifact, a connective network which might catalyze various forms of translation, or perhaps remain untranslatable yet indexically charged, still active, indicating that a gesture had taken place, untranslated, operating and persisting for millions, perhaps billions of years. Now, again, Arrival is a very optimistic version of this scenario because Arrival posits the aliens as being friendly, benevolent, even somehow for some reason needing human help. Very different cosmopolitics in Cixin Liu, dark cosmopolitics. Because it's predicated on these notions, the axioms of cosmic sociology, which are offered by Ye Wenji to one of her younger colleagues, the younger colleague has no idea what Ye Wenji has done and what she's aware of, what she knows. And she says, first, survival is a primary need of a civilization. Second, civilization continuously grows and expands, but the total matter in the universe remains constant. In other words, resources are limited. Civilization always wants to grow. One more thing. To derive a basic picture of cosmic sociology from these two axioms, you need two other important concepts, chains of suspicion and the technological explosion. Younger scientist says to her, interesting terms, can you explain them? Ye Wenji glanced at her watch. There's no time, but you're clever enough to figure them out. Use those two axioms as a starting point for your discipline, and you might end up becoming the Euclid of cosmic sociology. Well, you're also clever enough to figure it out. Every civilization goes through technological explosion. We on Earth are going through them right now. In only a few centuries, look what we have done. If that's the rule for any advanced civilization, then any advanced civilization will go from the Stone Age to the Space Age in just a few centuries. Or could. And chains of suspicion. Do you understand what I'm talking about? You probably kind of do, but you probably also have scratched your head a few times in the past hour and a half and thought, what the fuck is he talking about? Does he even know what he's talking about? Is he going to explain it next week? Is Carla going to unpack this in a few weeks? Does this make sense at all? Maybe it doesn't. And you're humans, right? We co-evolved at 1G on this planet, breathing this atmosphere. All the other commensal and parasitic creatures around us, we co-evolved, and we're not sure that we know what we're saying to each other. Chains of suspicion. My goodness, those aliens that evolved on Centauri, different gravity field, different chemistry, different solar composition, whole bunch of different local conditions, so different, so alien, that we have no way of knowing what they might want or think. So how can we build a pathway to communicate with them? Well, interestingly, in Chishin-Lu, humans and the Trisolarians do communicate. It ends up boiling down to being a kind of a resource grab on the part of the Trisolarians because their own solar system is so messed up. Sorry for the spoiler. In the larger context of the dark forest situation, which is that in our galaxy and presumably across all galaxies, all aliens are afraid of each other because they have no idea what the motivation might be, and there's no way of ever knowing. And they also know that the other alien civilization might go through a technological spike, which takes them from the space age to the post-speed of light travel age in the drop of a hat. And so that is the constitution of the dark forest cosmic sociology. So how can we go beyond that? It's depressing as hell. I think, Alexandra, you probably remember me talking about this like a couple of years ago, or Tegan, maybe you remember, like when I first read the Chishin-Lu in 2015, it coincided with the death of one of my family members. So that probably had a lot to do with it. But I went through a crisis that was just quite deep, and I didn't see my way out of it for quite a few years. So this is dark stuff. So how do we move beyond that? How do we move beyond the framework? Well, let's go back to the example we looked at an hour ago. Let's go back to Phocion. Is it possible that we could make arguments about universalist gestures? How would we even try to start making that argument? Well, we could start with Phocion, because Phocion is basically saying that material systems self-organize, human culture self-organize, ecosystems self-organize, human thought self-organizes. It's all a big spectrum of interconnected, networked, layered self-organization that's governed by principles, formalist principles. So presumably languages also, yes. And an alien cognition would be also, yes. An alien language also, potentially, yes. So how do we scientifically compass the world around us to be able to make that assertion with reasonable confidence? An alien mind would be part of a universalist frame that we can map by understanding these material or cultural systems. George Bataille gives us a similar set of rules from a cursed share, or questions and rules, linking it back to energy expenditure, right? What do humans do, and any self-regulating systems do with the excess energy that they have? The problem of growth. Just as the herbivore relative to the plant and the carnivore relative to the herbivore is a luxury, man is the most suited of all living beings to consume intensely the excess energy offered up by the pressure of life to conflagrations befitting the solar origins of its movement. George Bataille was making the exact same argument that Lem makes in Summa. Of course, Nietzsche says man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman. Well, I think it would be better to say that any sapient system is a rope stretched between non-sapient systems and some kind of super sapient system. So from an ecological perspective, systems eating systems, systems nested inside systems. Again, the example of planetary stability, material systems bundling together different temporalities. What did Schrödinger say? In What is Life? Living matter evades the decay to equilibrium. A piece of matter is said to be alive when it goes on doing something, moving, exchanging material with its environment for a much longer period than we would expect an inanimate piece of matter to keep going. Gaia, is the planet living? Are subsets, systems of the planet living? Is the atmosphere, which when we see it like this, we realize it's a gas in a liquid? Is its formalism alive? That cosmological frame. So you see, some of you have seen me do parts of this lecture. I keep making this argument. Energy, feedback loops, feed-forward loops, self-sustaining systems, jumps in scale, energy flow and information flow, as Michel Serre makes the argument in his Thermodynamics and Language essay. Yeah. Information theory, language, flows of energy in life, entropy, systems that reverse entropy, Schrödinger's notion. What would you need? Well, Schrödinger was looking at what he called, crystalline lattices from which life could proceed. Didn't know what DNA was when he wrote that. Hypothesized something like DNA. Where is the stable system, or where are the interconnections between multiple stable systems that make it possible for the fire that is both at the center of our solar system and is also the wet fire that's burning in every one of your cells chemically, to then create the epiphenomenon, which is cognition and arguably sapience, that journey upriver. We're interested in this relationship between models of energy flow and mind to material and biological systems. Can bios and zoe, non-human inorganic life, organic life as cohabitations, be understood in this kind of general economy of modes of mind? We'll come back to Freeman Dyson. Let me take a quick look at where we're at, because this is a pretty big talk. And I think I'm almost done, actually. Oh yeah, I am. This is the wrap up. We'll come back to Freeman Dyson in a week or two, because he talks specifically about what it means for seemingly negative entropic systems to be even possible. And he essentially says that any material system that's situated in a gravity gradient, any object whose motions are dominated by gravity, as he says, will have energy decreasing as temperature increases and energy increasing as temperature decreases. The second law causes local contrasts to increase together with entropy. So this is the kind of argument for the possibility of life at a cosmological scale. Hence, potentially an argument for the possibility of different forms of mind, different forms of life, different forms of mind. We will go back through Leroy Gorhan a bit in about 3 weeks. And Leroy Gorhan in Gesture and Speech, drawing these comparisons between, for humans, this, quote, operational synergy between tool and gesture. This very beautiful short quote, which presupposes the existence of a memory in which the behavior program is stored. Where is that memory, this behavior program? With animals, this memory forms part of the organic behavior as a whole, and the technical operation becomes, in the popular sense, instinctive. If we look at the fictional mouse from Villeneuve's film of Dune, my favorite part in the entire film, this little mouse, which is sweating from its gigantic ears. And then, like the Fremen wearing their still suits on Arrakis, it's licking its hands, its paws, and drinking its own sweat. It has evolved, not unlike plenty of creatures on our Earth here in reality. It has evolved a feedback system which allows it to capture most of its lost moisture. Presumably, like a dog, it doesn't sweat anywhere except its ears. Dogs don't sweat through their ears. Dogs have to pant, right? Presumably, this little mouse only sweats through its ears so that it can capture all the moisture that's lost. So that's the instinctive technical operation with animals, part of the organic behavior as a whole. And of course, for us as humans, and this is very familiar to most or all of you, intermeshing of tools and the mode of gesture, again from Leroy Gorham, looking at the evolution from direct action of hand all the way to indirect mobility, and then the hand used to set off a programmed process, which is what we do with all the technicities that we've built. But we keep talking in this seminar, we will keep talking about designed cognition and the scale of designed cognition. Like, what is the scale of designed cognition? My God, 31,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago, a Chauvet cave, and the handprint in the cave, the hand, mind, eye gesture, which is a prototype neurophysiologically, notation and labeling. It's connected to notation and labeling. The kind of neurophysiological limits of you and I as humans, and the legacy of the hand to eye to image to gesture, the kind of primordial early representation, theater, notation, and proto-cinema. That's what Herzog says in the film. He argues that the cave paintings in Chauvet were proto-cinema. And gesture linked to other systems like sound, or the bone of an animal, or a twig of a tree being turned, or a reed being turned into a flute. So what are the notation systems on top of physical systems which blend human gesture and sense perception with a new class of ontologies of perception? And we can ask, because we'll spend some time over the coming weeks working with, ChatGPT and maybe Midjourney and tools like that. We can ask, what is the new class of ontologies of perception that we can work with right now, which we are training right now as humans in the loop? And what new forms of cognition are we crafting with our interactions with those systems and our prompt engineerings? And how can this be linked? I would say, well, of course, through synesthesia to soundscapes, yes, music even, movement and gesture. But then how can we link it, thinking back a few minutes, to these larger universalist frameworks that we have to draw from the work of people like Cixin Liu and Lem? Are there universalist frameworks that we can imagine? So if we go to Phocion once more, this beautiful passage where he talks about Daphne and Daphne's hands being raised against Apollo, because Apollo, bastard that he is trying to kidnap and ravage Daphne, and she's transformed into a tree. Held against the wind, spread out and separated like a frond, her hands urged her on to an understanding of fluids. They provided her with numerous and delicately sensitive surfaces for knowledge of atmosphere and of water. This is Phocion, right? Polyalou painted a pretty Daphne overtaken by metamorphosis at the very moment Apollo was about to reach her. Her arms are becoming tree limbs. Already the extremities are leafy branches stirred by gentle breezes. I seem to see primitive man inhaling the world through his hands, stretching his fingers into a web to catch the imponderable. My hands, said the centaur, have felt rocks, waters, plants without number, and the subtlest impressions of atmosphere. For I lift up my hands on dark, still nights to detect the breezes and so discover signs to make sure of my way. The centaur and Daphne, both favorites of the gods, had in metamorphosis or not, no weapons other than those of our race, in other words, other than the hands, to feel out the universe, to experience even those translucent currents which have no substance and which the eye does not see. Now, the hand, well, the hand, the gesture, the intimacy of the hand, it's all a crucial part of it. But I would also say here, and I imagine Phocion is thinking that too, the neurophysiology, the innervation of the hand-eye, hand gesture, the information pathways coming from the unbelievable sensitivity you have in your fingers and your palms to your mind. The neurophysiology of the hand is a crucial part of this argument. So does that mean that we have to imagine designing cognition, designing AI, interacting with aliens such that it's through the hands? No, it's not the argument exactly I'm making here. It's that there's a neurophysiological model that our hands are one example of. That's worth considering across different scales of time. And in coupling with the neurophysiologies of the eye, the ear, the gesture, and the arcs of perception that the mind can grasp. So where is the individual? Where is the collective? Where's the mind? As Schrödinger says, consciousness finds itself intimately connected with and dependent on the physical state of a limited region of matter, the body. What is mind, and where is the mind that can, for example, like Ruskin in Stones of Venice, compare the flows across hundreds of years of cultures into the city, constituting the city, to geological processes, which we can then extend, as we saw in Ghost in the Shell Innocence, right? In that incredible passage, which we can extend to external exogenous form, like the body of the city, or the technical stack layers that we have built. Schrödinger again says, a living organism continually increases its entropy, or as you may say, produces positive entropy, and thus tends to approach the dangerous state of maximum entropy, which is death. It can only keep aloof from it by continually drawing, in other words, alive, by continually drawing from its environment negative entropy, consuming structured matter, which is something very positive, as we shall see. What an organism feeds upon is negative entropy, structured matter. Or to put it less paradoxically, the essential thing in metabolism is that the organism succeeds in freeing itself from all the entropy it cannot help producing while alive. Well, we will situate this with Freeman Dyson and Lineweaver and Egan and some others. We'll situate this question of entropy, negative entropy, structured matter, feedback loops against a universal framework, and with Lem, a universal framework. But we should ask poetically also, what mind, what world, what universe, what pocket universe is possible? Are we going to try to design? As Peirce says, again, in Eliot's translation, so I apologize for you French speakers who are reading the French on the left side of the screen here. As Eliot says, I have halted my horse by the tree of the doves. I whistle a note so sweet. Shall the rivers break faith with their banks? Living leaves in the morning, fashioned in glory. Does this essence drive the cognition that we have, that we will design? It isn't giving too much away to read literally the last lines from the Chisholm trilogy. The message in a bottle and the ecological sphere were the only things left in the mini universe. The bottle faded into the darkness, so in this 1 cubic kilometer universe, only the little sun inside the ecological sphere gave off any light. In this minuscule world of life, a few clear, watery spheres drifted serenely in weightlessness. One tiny fish leapt out of a watery sphere and entered another, where it effortlessly swam between the green algae. On a blade of grass on one of the miniature continents, a drop of dew took off from the tip of the grass blade, rose spiraling into the air, and refracted a clear ray of sunlight into space. So what does it mean to design cognition for a universalist scale? What does it mean to think about energy flow, information flow? What does it mean to think across so many different scales of space and time? What does it mean to imagine effective communication between essentially alien systems, whether that's you communicating with me or us communicating with AI through machine learning systems to produce images like this, or us communicating with AGI to talk to it, or us communicating with real aliens without knowing what kind of linguistics or biology or mind they have at all. Those are some of the questions that we'll deal with across the coming weeks. And again, for folks who've seen some of my talks before, I apologize if you hear too many refrains, but hopefully it's good to meditate on these issues and resituate them in new contexts. So that's an introduction to the next few weeks. Let's take a Let's take a 5-minute break. I think we still have 40 minutes left. So let's take a 5-minute break for coffee and bathroom, and come back for a discussion. See you all at 3:55 Eastern Time. Hey, everybody. So how shall we continue? At this point, I usually would open it up to everybody for conversation. I know that was a super intense talk, but hopefully there were a few threads that were legible as we moved through it, and we can have a conversation today about that.
Okay, does anyone has anything to comment on this? Because this was a lot, huh? It was a lot to take. I think they're processing it.
Yeah,
Me too, huh? But
Yeah, I could say something.
yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks for the very, very interesting lecture. I'm new to the new center, so this is all it's really fascinating stuff. I guess to me the question becomes, when it seems like life and intelligence and mind can be summed up, at least to some extent, as systems and patterns, and the sort of the inputs and outputs in those systems and patterns. But you can easily begin to expand that sort of conception to include, you know, practically everything. Everything is either part of a system, or it can be sort of, there's a system around the construction of the thing, even like a chair or a table. So how do we begin to articulate a notion of intelligence when it seems like it can very quickly slip into everything is intelligence or has intelligence? Maybe that's not a problem. Maybe that's just a reframing of our you know, the way we view the world. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I get myself into big trouble by starting to talk about Deleuze's book on Spinoza, because I'm not a deep scholar either of Spinoza or Deleuze in that particular book. But there is a chapter in it that I remember being really important for me years ago. A chapter, I think, titled "What Can a Body Do?" And in it, he essentially is extrapolating off of Spinoza, arguing that we can't talk about bodies and the limits of them until we start talking about how we know what they can do and the capacity that they have to affect or be affected. It's a power to, not only the power to affect, quote, externalities, but the power to be affected, you know? And so that has always been really useful for me. I would consider myself an idiot savant, mostly idiot and a little bit savant when it comes to, you know, really reading that particular example from Deleuze, but still like hanging on like a drowning person really tightly to the rope that provides me, because it it starts off by pointing out, well, we have to talk about where the limit of any given body is. We start talking about a body like, oh, I raised up a 4 terabyte hard drive a few minutes ago. What's the end? What's the extent of this body? You know, physical extents? No, it's a network device. Every once in a while, it gets plugged into my computer, and I back things up onto it, or I find archives of things from 2 decades ago, that sort of thing. And so you start building in a kind of a taxonomy and an ontology around any given subject of interest. And then you start saying, well, what can it do? And what can other things do to it? And so it becomes a little bit of an overly lengthy process. I don't know, like some of you may or may not be fans of Lord of the Rings, you know, the Tolkien epic. There's a really very funny, I'm a kind of a geek for it, believe it or not. There's a kind of a very funny moment where quite deep into the storyline, some of the hobbits meet these tree creatures called Ents. And the Ents are one of the oldest living creatures in Middle Earth. They're just impossibly ancient. The only thing that's older than them is Tom Bombadil. And the Ents, when they get together to talk, it takes them days or weeks to even have a conversation. And of course, the hobbits are enormously impatient because there's a war going on and they need to mobilize the Ents and so forth. And, there's this very funny moment where the Ents do get together to have a conversation, and the hobbits come back after hours and they say, well, how's it going? And Fangorn, the oldest Ent, basically says, well, we haven't even finished saying our names yet. It's something like that. And so the problem, Tyler, of being able to talk about what a body can do starts being burdensome, because you have to start defining and defining more and defining more. And it kind of balloons out into being this like problem of not even being able to. So there's like a stop that you have to make somewhere in there. It's kind of like the halting problem a little bit, maybe conceptually, where you just have to say, okay, no, I kind of have an idea that this thing can connect via a cable to a computer. Let's start working with it. And so there's a certain degree of just raw experimentation that then has to take place. It's like becoming friends with someone. There's a really great moment, or becoming lovers with someone. There's a really great moment in Annihilation. You remember near the end of the film where she gets to the lighthouse and she goes down into the hole, and down in the hole, there's this insane like fractal form that's quasi-intelligent. It samples a little bit of her blood, and one of her mission team leader is down there going crazy and like transforming, exploding. And she comes out, and this humanoid figure comes out and is with her. And at first it's like this shiny, silvery kind of humanoid figure, and it seems like it's attacking her. It's really pretty violent. It pins her, but then it starts dancing with her, and it's a perfect mimesis. And she dances with it a little bit, and clearly she's terrified, or maybe she's not terrified, but she doesn't know quite what to do. And then it starts turning into her. It imitates even her clothing. It's not like a naked human. It's even making a t-shirt. And so she grabs a phosphorus grenade and she pops it and she hands it to the alien, which is almost identical to her at that moment. And she skedaddles, and the alien blows up and burns, and seems like the alien invasion is over then. Of course it isn't. So there's this moment of mimesis gesturally, which takes place, but it's very superficial in the film, really, because we've already seen that her body is refracted. She already, quote, as she notes to one of her companions earlier, she's already got it in her, and her companion said, well, it's all of us at this point, so the idea that the alien would have to simulate a human form, like an IK chain driven rigged human, and kind of dance with her, it's kind of ludicrous on a certain level. But maybe it isn't. I mean, maybe it's just another form of refraction. Okay, well, I got into your blood cells and I've duplicated myself, me, this alien, in your blood cells, and I've hybridized one of your companions with a wild boar and a bear, and and I morphed your other companion into a rose bush. So now I'll be a humanoid figure, and I'll dance with you a little bit. And so I feel like, Tyler, I feel like maybe that's another way of looking at it. It would be to say, well, there's cataloging and mapping and building conceptual models about what the limit of the body is, but then there's just kind of like dancing. It's like, I also tell this anecdote frequently. When I studied Tai Chi, Carla and I studied Tai Chi with a real master some years ago. And Richard was this very laid back, mellow, unassuming figure. But then when you did push hands with him, you felt like you were in contact with a mountain. It's unbelievable. I have almost never felt another human being like that. It was super gentle and immovable at the same time. It was amazing, amazing feeling. Sorry if this sounds like woo woo, kind of like, oh, he was superhuman. He wasn't. He died, sadly. But when we did push hands with him, we felt like we were in connection with some kind of totally non-human system that he was channeling. It was amazing. And so that gesture was just about contact. I can talk to you about it, and you can kind of say like, wow, that sounds interesting. I wonder what that was like. But you won't know it because you'd have to do push hands with someone who was a Tai Chi master like Richard was. And so maybe that's the other aspect of it, is like, we package all this language stuff into all this experience into language. We package all this experience into language stuff. And then there's this beautiful description of this in, I think it's Andrew Morrow's book, Impossible Languages, where the problem with language is you have this reservoir of experience, which is decades, and then Ballardian like millennia behind you. But to talk about it, you have to squeeze it into this like low bandwidth linear, time linear thing called words, and then squirt them out at some other creature that has ears, which then parses them. And so all that experience has to get like squeezed through this tiny little tube and then unpacked on the other side. And so it seems that maybe it's a simultaneous process of reiteratively trying to build models combined with just gesture. Those two things together. And it's going to be more than just two things, you know what I mean? But maybe it's like that. And maybe that's a helpful way of looking at it. That's, to be perfectly honest, that's the way I've been trying to navigate the problem. And I also incorporate sound and image, film, edit, music, soundscape, as an intuitive and totally non-linguistic and non-rational way of working through it. But then, coming back out of that and then resituating it and trying to build a model around it, an ontology around it, a framework around it, concept models around it. Back and forth. Yeah. It's been very interesting the past year working with machine learning image generation systems. How many of you have played around a little bit with Midjourney or Wombo or Dream Studio? A couple of you. Yeah, two or three. Yeah, for me, it has been just wild experience. Every time I work with Dream Studio or even with Wombo, which is usually like a bit more like rough and low res, I feel like I'm traversing vast reservoirs of cultural knowledge and documentation of the world, photographs, architecture, cities, paintings, art, modes of being. It's really been remarkable. I don't ascribe any sapience to those systems or ChatGPT. I've had some wild conversations with ChatGPT in the past few months. Really cool. But it's interesting because part of it is being in a highly analytical space, the way that we are in academic engagements like this, and maintaining that while I'm working, not as well as some of my friends like Kazis Farnellis, who's also teaching something at New Center this spring. Kazis has been super rigorous about building a conceptual framework about the way he works with Midjourney and DALL-E, and then enacting the experiments and assessing the experiments and then writing about them and doing more. He's been super, super rigorous about it. I've been a little bit more intuitive. So I spend time assessing, but then when I go in and I work, it's very much about intuition and gesture and just following the path. And almost every time I end up doing this, it's really, it ends up producing work that I want to spend time with. So it feels successful to me. I also know that on the back end for Night Cafe and Midjourney and Dream Studio and all the large organizations that are building AI and machine learning systems, whatever we do with it is useful, because all they're doing is they're expanding their already multiple billion image to text pairings into a larger space of more image to text pairings. So for them, the kind of taxonomy, ontology, labeling, notation, a tokenization process is just super useful seems inadequate, but it's yielding tremendous profit for them. Sometimes financial, of course, but largely just in terms of building out larger data sets, large models that are going to, quote, be better at doing, what these images are doing. So I think that that's also, for me, that's been a very interesting experience in the past year, just working with tools like that are fundamentally different than any computationally based tools I've worked with over all the years I've been working with computers. And I suppose there are a lot of different ways of doing it. I think Holly Herndon's work, her work, and with Matt Dryhurst also, I think their work is really, really interesting and super rigorously thought through. So that might be another example from the kind of music, sound, machine learning, AI space that would be interesting for people to look at. That obviously has an intuitive component, but also has a very, very strong, conceptual framework driving it.
I'm trying to follow. Hi, first of all, Ed, sorry for the interruption. Thank you again for your lecture. Trying to follow what you just said about that. You were telling us about the way you've been using AI and so on, and this sort of, at least for me, unless I haven't get it correctly, already implicates some sort of translation or empathy, which is the thing that you were talking about as an issue, right? So I was wondering if you could put it into those terms, the sort of experience you've had with AI, be it with image or with sound. I mean, personally, I have mostly tried with visual data, let's say, and sound a bit too, but obviously there's a limit when it comes to references, and being from Peru or even Latin America, whatever, there's already a limit to what one can do. But that's another topic. I'm just focusing on the things of empathy and translation, and since you already also talked about AI as some sort of giving us a contrasting picture of what intelligence is or could be or already is, do you have already a link of thoughts, train of thoughts around that? Because you have posited the question today. So
yeah. I can definitely I can share a bunch of the chat GPT chats that I've had. Everything ranging from giving it a prompt with some Depeche Mode lyrics and asking it to rewrite them and getting some really wild results, super fabulous, to having a really long conversation with it about what it would mean to build out pocket universes. And I think one of the limitations of ChatGPT, well, an obvious limitation is it doesn't think. It's a pattern matching system. It does generate, and it can extrapolate patterns. The lyric rewriting, the Depeche Mode lyric rewriting was fantastic, and I'll share that with everybody. I'll put a bunch of documents in the Google Drive for you to look at. But clearly it's drawing on data sets it's been trained on that have to do with poetic meter and lyrics, and it just was pretty good at extrapolating them. Notwithstanding Nick Cave saying that, when it wrote a Nick Cave song, it sucked, whatever, of course it probably sucked from Nick Cave's point of view, but that's okay. It is a pattern matching system. And sometimes it's going to write shit lyrics, and sometimes it's going to write something that's interesting. Just like when I'm working with Wombo, sometimes I've generated a lot of stuff with Wombo. I use it as a super fast, art direction tool. And then if I get something really good, I can use it. But if I get something only so good, then I'll switch over to another tool like Dream Studio, and I'll work, for a few hours in Dream Studio, which typically will give much better results. But with Wombo, there's, after working with it for some hours, and at this point working with it for months, there's a period where it will return permutations that are incomplete, at least according to what I'm looking for. It's my assessment. Wombo isn't assessing it as incomplete. Wombo did a certain number of iterations and stopped, and there was the image that came out of it. Using assessment intuition to follow what Wombo's doing, and then doing like very subtle prompt engineering, moving commas and periods and exclamation points, or taking like the third phrase in a prompt and moving it to the front and so forth, and spending like 4 hours doing that in a single session. You feel these kind of larger flows of pattern organization. I know that some humans think that that is an index of empathy in the AI system. I don't. I think what it's doing, what's happening, is I'm looking for a set of pattern end results that I'm gonna like according to a set of criteria that sometimes are very rigorously defined and sometimes very loosely defined. And then I'm just gonna keep working with the inputs to get the other agent, which in that case happens to be a machine learning AI system like Wombo or Night Cafe. This was a VQ-GAN system. Some of the other images that I had in the presentation were stable diffusion images. I don't think that's empathy. I think that that's a pretty complex but rules-constrained system, which is the machine learning image production system, and me finding ways to kind of move it around. It's even less complicated than herding sheep, although that might be a useful, metaphor. I don't feel like that's empathy. But, and I made this point recently in a conversation with someone, it's a mistake to look at ChatGPT, like what was his name, Blake Lemoine did a few months ago with the Google toolkit, and say like, it's aware. We have to change what we're doing. That's pareidolia. It's looking at another system, and it's like seeing Jesus Christ in the toast. You know what I mean? Like you see the burnt toast, and my gosh, that's a picture of Jesus Christ. Come on, it just happened to be burnt that way. And every once in a while, burnt toast is going to look like someone's face. So don't make too much out of it. So I think, unfortunately, Lemoine fell into that kind of trap. But at the same time, the system is much, much more complex than a piece of burnt toast, at least on the scale of the image in the toast. And so what's going on there? I would equate Night Cafe or ChatGPT to a sub routine in a simple brain, like a cat brain, like a small portion of a cat's brain, or maybe even a small portion of my brain and your brain, like a really small portion. That's what ChatGPT is. And like Ben Gertzel said in that quote I read earlier on, ChatGPT is way better than you and me at like sifting through millions of patterns in a couple of seconds. It's so much faster and better than you and I could ever be. But it's nowhere near as good as you and I can be at other kinds of pattern matching. And so the empathy that is happening when I work with these tools, for me, I don't ever feel like there's real empathy the way that you and I could have through shared experience as humans. Not yet. In any person who feels that kind of human level empathy with a machine learning system, in my mind, is just kind of being tricked, because humans can be tricked very easily. That's why I name-checked Antonin Artaud partway through the talk in relationship to the Nazis, right? Artaud's vision was radical. The Nazis' vision was fascist, totalitarian, murderous, and they took advantage of the exact same mechanism in human neuropsychology, right? So I don't think that we're having real empathy with these systems yet, but we are having a rich exchange. And right now I feel like these, like the Leitão 5 billion image to text pairing data set, it's a tiny subcomponent of a much bigger mind that's being built, with which it might actually be possible to have something more like a human to human empathy, or a human to cat empathy, or a human to forest empathy. Right now, it's not at that level. But I actually personally feel pretty optimistic that in a decade or less, it's going to accelerate to that place where the empathy that you and I feel when we create an image. Like I have had some experiences in the past year which are just uncanny. working on prompts of Orpheus emerging from the underworld, using Alain Delon in the prompt, and then Wombo just kicking me back tons of images, which are a male figure looking back at a female figure. I didn't prompt it with Eurydice, but of course she's going to be there because the whole goddamn Orpheus story is about Orpheus looking back when he shouldn't have. So the entire data set that these machine learning systems are trained on includes images of Orpheus and her and Hermes leading her back into the underworld. So those figures surfacing in the image, they aren't surfacing because the system understands that I wanted to see the Orphean tragedy. They're surfacing because there's a bunch of images and paintings and sculptures that already had, Orpheus in relationship to her, and, the loss and the tragedy, and then, the Maenads tearing him to pieces, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? So like if I have that weird experience, which I have had a bunch on the Orpheus images that I've been producing, it's only because the data set already includes those compositions. It's not really the system trying to talk to me yet. But I think in the next decade, it will start getting closer to that. Then I feel like, Maria, I feel like we're going to have to redefine empathy. Because there are so many different ranges of empathy. The empathy that you and I have when we have an animal companion. Like I've had cats in my life that are as close to me as almost any other human has ever been. And I miss them terribly. And they were really good friends to me. And Carla and I, our cats, we were so close to them. We don't have any now, but we were so close to them. I can't believe that there wasn't a powerful empathic relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that the cats loved us in the same way. I mean, it could be that it was strongly driven by what Michel Serres talks about when he talks about the kind of emergence of care and love. You and I are warm-blooded creatures. Cats are warm-blooded creatures too. They loved to sit on my lap when I was watching a movie. They purred. They were happy. I was keeping them warm. And like my friend Adam Greenfield says, the cat looks at you, and what does it see? It sees a can opener. A warm, cuddly can opener. Yes, feed me, feed me. That's how Carla and I used to call the cats in from the forest outside. We'd go to the door and we'd hold up a can of tuna fish. They wouldn't be anywhere. We'd open the door and we'd, honey, tsutsu, tuna. 30 seconds later, cat comes tearing out of the forest like, I'm here, tuna. Now, again, I'm not diminishing the love that they might have felt for us. I'm just not sure what it was, And so I feel like expanding the definition of empathy critically and looking for what might be happening now as we work with AI and machine learning systems, and being really like as cynical about it as we can right now, but also being aware that there might be, as these systems develop in the next few years, really remarkable emergences happening on top of the stuff that I personally would not classify as being empathic at all. Now, anyway, Maria, there's this other thing, which is like the Eduardo Kohn approach to how forests think, and how it's partly something that needs to be conducted as like an ethnographic and anthropological study, simultaneously an ecological study, simultaneously like very much taking seriously the idea that non-standard modes of cognition are real. So when Kohn talks about the forest's thinking, Kohn really means that the forest is thinking, but it gets situated in the nutrient richness or nutrient poorness of sandy soil next to a river, and how over thousands of years that impacts the evolution of plants' ability to defend themselves from predators that might eat their leaves. And then that gets fit into the broader framework of how a forest might think. And then that gets situated ethnographically and anthropologically against how humans live in forests in certain places like the rainforest, and how they develop their own models of thought and of being and of relation to the non-human. And so that, it seems to me, is like a really important project in reframing empathy, where empathy isn't just like, I feel really good, you feel really good, or I'm so sad, you're sad too. You know what I mean? And I'm not diminishing those things, because empathy as shared feeling is sometimes about really simple things like, I feel really good. You feel really good? Yes. Okay, that's great. You know, but it's also something that's beyond that. So maybe that's a long-winded way of picking up the empathy question that you raise, you know? I also am kind of optimistic, even though I'm fearful that the dark forest example is the right example.
I haven't read that book, but I have read like the Dark Forest theory of the internet, and I totally hated it. I mean, not hate it, but I found it like so easy to dismiss, for me at least. So yeah, I mean, I should read also the Cixin Liu text, but yeah, but the Dark Forest theory of the internet was for me at least a disappointment. But yeah, I mean, I don't want like to take much of the time, but what you have said like has also raised another sort of questions, and maybe we can, I hope that to find a space to talk about them, about this like modeling of empathy or different model, if that is the answer, or another things. But thanks, and I just pass the mic on to someone else.
Thanks.
Should we talk a little bit about the projects before we wrap up?
Maybe that's good, yeah, because we have we only have a few more minutes. Again, it's I think we have to, over the next week or 2 weeks, understand what each of you wants to do, because we will, Carla and I will support essentially whatever you want to do. If someone wants to generate over the next 8 or 9 weeks a project absolutely new, that's terrific. If you want to work in a team of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, that's terrific also. If you have a project that you have ongoing, that this framework would be excellent to essentially have a support cohort and a feedback cohort through, then that's something that we're really interested in doing as well for you. And as I noted, Carla is going to sort of drop in about halfway through the 8 weeks, and she'll be joining to provide feedback on work in progress. So it's a little bit open-ended, you know, right now, but typically when we run research, can't quite call it a studio. A studio would be like 14 weeks, 3 times a week, and this is 8 weeks, once a week. But it's kind of like a mini studio when we run these. We take the first couple of weeks to just figure out what everybody wants to do and is looking for. You know, one logistic issue that came to mind is in the past we've used Slack, and as probably most or all of you know, Slack changed its policy this past year, so they don't allow you to keep 10,000 or whatever the number was messages. They only go 90 days back in history, which totally stinks to maintain a kind of a mini studio like this, where a year from now we might actually want to drop in and have a conversation again. And I actually haven't resurrected some of our Slacks from a year or 2 or 3 ago, because this whole thing played out, and I wrote to Slack and I said, we have this problem, and they wrote back saying, oh, you could convert your Slacks. And I've read elsewhere that it's not possible. Maybe some of you have experience doing this. So instead of using Slack as a platform, I just wanted to raise the question, does anyone have any preference for what we might use as a discussion platform? I mean, it could be Discord. Maybe we create a channel on the New Center Discord. I see some heads nodding. Is that like, yeah, maybe we use Google Drive and Discord, maybe? Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's say that we'll start like that, and if for some reason it isn't working, we can obviously do other stuff. But
I guess it will be also Miro, right? I guess it will be later also Miro board for the project.
Yes. We can use the Miro boards, the Miro boards. Those have been really good for studio, where we just, you know, we have one board which is like a working board, and people have work in progress for a few weeks. Then we create another board which is presentation material. It's worked pretty well for Carla and for me also. Yeah.
I just want to say that I'm really happy we're going to open the topic of sentience versus sapiens, because it's a back and forth dilemma for me. I opened the topic a little bit with a few folks from Antikythera, and I'm still like, the more I open it, the more I want to know more about it. But he also mentioned about intuition, gesture, sentience, and conscious, part of the part of sentience. And somewhere it feels like on the way, it feels like sapiens is more of a reservoir that we need to drop once we scale up. But I just thoughts that I'm happy that we're going to talk about this topic, because it's I really want to know more about it.
Yeah, well, for me, it's totally fascinating, because the Stephen Shaviro's book Discognition is fabulous on this topic, and we will read some of Peter Watts. Going back to Blindsight for me, I mean, I've read it so many times now, and every time I go back to it, I appreciate it again. The way that he very brutally and cynically argues against sapiens in a way, especially when he, as an evolutionary marine biologist, situates life against energy availability, and then jumps up to the cosmological scale. It's just fantastic. We can see if we can get Peter to drop in and join us for a conversation. He's done that in the past. And this, I think, would be an excellent context for it. In fact, I introduced him and Stephen Shaviro about 5 years ago in a seminar I was teaching. They had known each other's work, and Stephen, of course, written about Peter, and I got them together to have a conversation, and I was super, super happy about that. So maybe we could do a rerun of that. Although it's funny, like, I think it was last year, was it the Atmosphere seminar? Stephen was going to be one of the guests lecturing, and I asked him, "Can you talk about discognition?" And he was like, "I don't know if I want to talk about discognition." But then he seemed like he was on board to do it, and then he just kept saying, "You know what? Discognition, I wrote that a while ago. I've kind of moved on." And then it ended up he didn't do a talk on it. So I've wanted to loop back with him, Alexandra, for like 2 or 3 years now, to say, "Stephen, what happened? And would you come and talk about discognition again, please?" Because I really would like to have him talk a bit about what you just brought up, because I think he's one of the best people ever. I mean, Catherine Hales would be fantastic too. I don't know her well. I've only been in a few conferences with her, but we could reach out to her and see if we can get her to come and have a chat with us. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm really, really fascinated by that gradient from sentience to sapience, and I'm super looking forward to spending the next couple of months with you folks on it, and happy to talk to you a little bit more about some of the work I'm doing around this stuff. Yeah. Hey, so do you all have the link to the syllabus? The syllabus is mostly done. I don't have the assignment for the 4th lecture yet, but the assignments for next week and the week after are in, and I think they're pretty much done. The 4th lecture, I'll get the assignment finalized and put in there. So you can look ahead 2 weeks, but then the 3rd one, it isn't in there yet. And I actually have put a lot of stuff in the syllabus this time. Usually I'll put in a bit of reading and a couple of films, and this time there's a ton of reading and a bunch of films. So looking at the syllabus, don't freak out and think like, "Oh my God, there's no way I can read all of that by next week." Just like sift through it, and selectively pick stuff, and I'll do a talk for an hour and 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of stuff we can talk about. Okay.
I haven't received that email, if that's, or have you posted in the Google Classroom about the syllabus?
I don't know.
No, I didn't receive it either.
No? Okay.
It'll
go
have a folder shared with you.
Okay.
The link to the syllabus is going to be uploaded to the Google Class.
Okay, great.
We have 4 minutes to wrap up. if we want, we can stay for chat of the record without the recording, but just keep this in mind.
Okay.
Oh, what happened?
Maybe you can. Yeah, please, Georgiana.
That I had a conversation with Stephen, recorded, and I insisted that it's going to be about this cognition, and he agreed. So
Good.
it's supposed to, like, basically I had an idea to open like a clandestine school, and to invite people and to have like this closed conversations. And because I started a project called Morphic Minds, and I entered the subject via poetics and poetry. And also I felt like a bit intimidated by the, very scholarly and transdisciplinary and pluridisciplinary sources that Stephen has, that this course also has.
Yeah.
And he agreed, although he also told me, I've written that book years ago. I have two more, and Rhythmic Image was
Yes.
the most recent, and I haven't read it, but already I was thinking, is this like, are like these image or text generated with AI, with language or image generators, have a certain rhythmicality in them, or thickness or viscosity. He speaks there more about these CGIs, music videos, and recent contemporary artists. But yeah, in the end, he agreed, and I think he's kind of grew more fond.
Yeah.
Yes, so maybe you can try to invite him again, and we're gonna also release it at some point. I need to do the work for that.
Cool. Yeah.
And yeah, maybe next time we can touch more upon, or my questions would be more about differences between metaphors and models, between let's say you spoke about anabase and catabase. I'm interested in pleurosis and kenosis. So all these like growths and regressions and hybridizations, and what like if poetry can be considered a way of like a sort of design of sorts. And yeah, looking forward for the seminar.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, look, have a quick look at the syllabus. You'll see, Georgiana, that Stephen's all over it for sure. We're going to read a bunch of stuff from Discognition, and Carla and I both love that book. And if you have any questions, I guess we'll get a channel going on Discord, and we can have a conversation going there. I'll be checking in on it daily, so I think I'll be available. Carla will be on it too. And if you have any, either pragmatic or material-oriented questions, we can start bouncing around conversation on Discord before next week. Yeah. Oh, in terms of films, I'll probably put most of the films onto the Google Drive. So please don't share the links to those. They're only for our course internally. I mean, obviously download them for yourself, but don't. And then I guess it's up to you what you do with them, but don't share the links on the Google Drives to anyone. Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.